When I look at Onision, I see him lying to himself much more than he lies to the public. He can never admit that he's wrong. He can never admit that he's lying. He can never really accept that it's his fault. You have this tragic contradiction where he pretends to be lighthearted. He pretends to be a comedian. But the reality of who he is this overly harsh, castigating, moralizing, punitive, authoritarian character. He hates himself. He hates humanity. He's constantly including short bursts of brutal and erratic violence in his videos for no reason. And it's not clear if he finds this therapeutic himself or if this is meant to shock or disgust the audience. He's really fiddling while Rome burns. And that's been the case. He's celebrating, he's exulting in his own ruination at every stage of his story. It's a very sad spectacle, but one that, as I say, makes me reflect on meaningful things in my own life, and I think meaningful philosophical questions for us all. I had been intending to make a video talking about truth and lies and honesty, and the meaning of these things in my own life, the ways in which Onision's peculiar pattern of being both publicly and privately dishonest makes me reflect on these philosophical questions in my own life. But my girlfriend asked me a very simple question that's probably a lot more relatable for you in the audience and maybe more useful for you to hear the answer to. My girlfriend asked me, why do you care about Onision at all? Why are you interested? Why are you still interested in following this story or in making videos discussing the story? Indeed, some of you who support me on Patreon might want to know, why are you not reading Aristotle instead? Why aren't you making more YouTube videos about the politics of Aristotle? Well, believe it or not, in some ways, what's rewarding and interesting to me in examining Onision's choices in life is quite similar to the sense of dramatic tension I have in reading the political philosophy of Aristotle. Some of you will relate to this, some of you won't. When I read history, when I read political philosophy, and even sometimes when I read overtly political fiction, there's a sense of tension for me as a reader that's not created intentionally by the author, but that arises from my awareness that if I were in the historical situation, if I were in the hypothetical situation being prevented, I would do the exact opposite of what the character in the book is doing. So, I don't watch horror movies, but I think that's kind of like the sense of somebody sitting in the audience at a horror movie saying, no, don't open the door, don't do that, or do the exact opposite of what the characters are inevitably going to do. In a reasonably profound way, that's how I feel in watching Onision's life fall apart again and again. I'm looking at a guy who has quite a long list of things in common with me. I probably discovered his YouTube channel around the time I was newly divorced, and he was divorced. He's now gone on to remarry. I guess I, in effect, have also gone on to remarry. Onision was one of the absolute first guys to come here on YouTube and do the vegetarian advocacy thing. Onision was absolutely the original voice of the vegetarian versus anti-vegetarian debate. A lot of you will not remember that. It's many, many years ago. Onision debated vegetarianism with The Amazing Atheist, and that was really part of the creation of this whole genre of videos that I spent 5 years of my life in. I'm vegan rather than vegetarian, but nevertheless, he's one of the guys who defined that genre. And that was part of the ascent to fame, not just of Onision and The Amazing Atheist, but of YouTube itself as a platform. It was really showing people, hey, this is a type of self-expression, this is a type of debate, and this is a type of political activism or advocacy for a cause that hadn't existed in the world before, that didn't exist on cable TV news, it didn't exist on, talk radio. This was something new and different. And it really is in that category that I've lived my life. What category do we mean? I basically sit down here and do overly honest monologues about my life and the things I care about, even if it's something relatively dry and academic like Aristotle. I mean, that's what I've got to offer. I'm not an expert in ancient Greek. Really, it's my it's the emotion and the honesty and the immediacy I bring to it that makes my commentary on the philosophy of Aristotle worth hearing, more than it's any technical expertise I bring to that field. I make no false pretensions about that. But across the board, whether I'm talking about my sex life or otherwise, and I mean, if you've been watching the YouTube channel for a long time, you guys know I also live very much in the same kind of gilded cage that Onision lives in, because YouTube really has been, for the past 5 years, my career. I know that may sound absurd. It's not a choice I made. When I started doing this, I had a very, very different career in mind for myself, but many other things didn't work out, and YouTube did. Now, I'm in the position to say at this point, I literally pay my rent with the income from YouTube and from my donors on Patreon. And even though my rent is very modest, as you can guess from the echoing sound in this apartment, my rent is cheap. But nevertheless, that really puts me in a rare class of people who gets to come on camera and talk about their feelings and talk about politics and earn money doing it, and earn enough to pay their rent. So it's a hobby that in some ways took over my life, as other ambitions in my life became impossible to pursue. Long story short. So there are many different ways in which I can sympathetically relate to Onision. I'm vegan, he's vegetarian, we were both divorced, and we both have the strange mix of opportunities and hopelessness of being stuck in this YouTube format as a career. There's a lot I can relate to there. And of course, he and I both have the sexual opportunities that YouTube micro fame presents to you. I know a lot of you won't believe me, but it doesn't matter if there's only one woman out of 1,000 who finds me attractive. YouTube is exactly the sort of venue where that one woman out of 1,000 will get in touch with you, and that can change your life. And I think it's fair to say, in the case of someone like Onision, you can see the way in which it can utterly corrupt and devastate your life. He's really fiddling while Rome burns. And that's been the case. He's celebrating, he's exulting in his own ruination at every stage of his story. It's a very sad spectacle, but one that, as I say, makes me reflect on meaningful things in my own life, and I think meaningful philosophical questions for us all. So yeah, there's this tremendous sense of tension for me in examining any given crossroads in his life, and feeling the same way I do when I see Aristotle making excuses for slavery. Like Aristotle, he tells you what's wrong with slavery 6 different ways. And then in his conclusion, he says, so slavery is wrong, but, it's necessary for our society, so we're going to do it anyway. So here's an excuse for it's going to continue. You think, no. If I were writing this book, I'd do the opposite. And now think, Aristotle didn't know how famous he'd be after his death, how influential he'd be. Think about how the whole history of the world would be different if you'd come to the conclusion that you yourself spell out 9/10 of, there's this strange, dramatic tension. Aristotle also gives you a completely damning argument against monarchy, which could have been much more influential historically, but he can't go all the way with it because he's in a situation where he's personally dependent on Alexander the Great. He's personally a friend of, or Alexander the Great is his client, and Alexander the Great's father was a patron of Aristotle's father before. It's a complex political situation, and whether or not he's forced to compromise, he chooses to compromise, and I'm sitting here on the edge of my seat feeling this sense of tension and dread, because if I were in Aristotle's position as an author or as a political leader or political activist in a sense, I'd be doing the exact opposite. When I look at Onision, I see him lying to himself much more than he lies to the public. He's intensely passionate about delivering to you this message that he couldn't possibly be happier with the fact that the woman he married now describes herself as a man, that he couldn't possibly be happier with the fact that she's having surgery to actually alter her body so that she looks less like a woman and looks more like a man. We have many indications, many cracks in the facade indicating that no, of course, he's desperately unhappy with that. And apparently he directly said to her and Sarah, the obvious truth, that really he wants to be in a relationship with a biological woman who looks and acts like a biological woman, that one of his reasons for wanting this three-way relationship was to be in a relationship with a woman who had the body of a woman as his wife goes through the transition to becoming his husband. Apparently, both a physical, surgical, and a psychological or behavioral change. So, this is not even the most dramatic example possible. If I were in his situation, I'd be doing the exact opposite. I mean, I wouldn't be lying to myself or the public. I wouldn't be lying to my wife or husband in this way. There's this weird, rattling, tragical quality. Even as he's smiling intently at the camera, even as he's insisting passionately that his marriage is the happiest marriage possible and it's wonderful, you can see that it's killing him. You can see the contradictions he lives with. And then, of course, it's not surprising, he somewhat violently acts out. Now, what I've just said is probably more sympathetic than anything I've ever heard anyone else say on the internet, either in writing or, in a YouTube video, in a YouTube monologue. I've said many times on this channel, sympathy is an analytical tool. It's not worthwhile to sympathize with someone just for the sake of that sympathy. What's really worthwhile is to use sympathy as a way of understanding others, understanding the problems they're facing, and understanding ourselves. Onision. He's the guy who invented the YouTube vegan debate, the ethical debates about veganism. He's the guy who, to some extent, invented or redefined this whole earnest monologue genre on the platform. And he's a guy who, for better and for worse, lived by trying to convince himself that he wasn't the only one who found his sense of humor funny. And of course, the greatest tragedy of all is that almost nobody else appreciates his sense of humor except for him. I'm not going to say he's never had a video I found funny, but I would guess that fewer than 1 out of 100 of his videos are to my taste or to anyone else's taste but his own. He does produce many, many hundreds of videos, so I know once in a while he has a hit. Once in a while he has something that really makes people laugh. But again, you have this tragic contradiction where he pretends to be lighthearted. He pretends to be a comedian. But the reality of who he is this overly harsh, castigating, moralizing, punitive, authoritarian character. He hates himself. He hates humanity. He's constantly including short bursts of brutal and erratic violence in his videos for no reason. And it's not clear if he finds this therapeutic himself, or if this is meant to shock or disgust the audience, or if he feels any sense of disgust himself. But again, it's almost as if his frustration with his own lack of a sense of humor, and when he's chosen to play the role of the professional comedian, this leads to, again, these kinds of violent contradictions in acting out, parallel to his stated philosophical commitment to being absolutely honest at all times when he's overtly, flagrantly been caught lying again and again and again. And he doesn't respond to that by being humbled or feeling humiliated. Even during some of the most dramatic and bizarre, twists and turns in the road, when his current wife, Lainey, briefly moved out and she filed divorce paperwork against him and so on. He can never admit that he's wrong. He can never admit that he's lying. He can never really accept that it's his fault. The whole world is his canvas, and yet he's obsessed with using that canvas to paint a flattering portrait of himself. So that, in short, is the character of Onision. Someone whom I have a few shallow things in common with on the surface, but where my alienation from him is so profound, it's so extreme. I have so little in common with him when you move past that surface that, for me, he's really an instructive glimpse into a whole side of human nature that I find so alien that I can barely admit to myself it really exists.
Dun, 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 dun.